If you think that living next to a forest your whole life means you can't get lost in it, you're mistaken. My name is Marina. I am 17 years old. I have lived my whole life with my parents not far from a huge forest. We managed the household, watched over the forest and the local animals. I always thought that I knew the area like the back of my hand. But something went wrong that day. It all started as usual. Breakfast, work in the garden, taking care of the animals, household chores. After lunch, I went into the woods for firewood. It was around 5 o'clock. Sunset was not far off, but I was sure I would gather enough branches in time. As I wandered through the woods looking for firewood, my head was filled with thoughts of the upcoming exams. The local school where I studied was an hour's drive from our home. My father took me there every day. I tried to study well, but it was difficult for me. Mentally repeating the material I had learned the day before, I kept going further and further away from home. The darkness of the forest enveloped me when I realized I was lost. About 40 minutes ago, I set off for firewood, thinking I knew this area better than anyone. But now everything was different. The mist and dense greenery around me were frightening, and the path I had been walking on was completely lost, leaving me alone in the midst of the dense forest. Panic seized my heart when I realized I was lost in this unforgiving green maze. A good amount of time had passed. I kept walking, trying to orient myself by the sound and the moonlight filtering through the leaves. But the farther I went, the quieter and more distressing it became around me. My steps faded, and the wind rustled only through the rare leaves, creating an eerie symphony. The feeling of unseen eyes watching my every move became increasingly unsettling. My heart began to beat faster when I heard something in the distance. It was a rustle among the trees. I froze in place, listening intently. The rustle stopped, and I breathed a sigh of relief, thinking it had all been my imagination. But in the next moment, a tall black silhouette loomed in front of me. My heart seemed to drop. The man, tall and thin, stood before me in a black hoodie with the hood covering his face. I couldn't see his gaze, but I shivered at how he stood motionless in my direction. I felt his gaze piercing right through me. I felt my heart wrench longingly and sink deep in my chest, causing me almost physically felt pain. My first thought was to run, but my legs refused to move. He slowly approached me. His gait was steady and unhurried. He was well aware of my state of being. When he came close enough, I felt his breath on my cheek. I still couldn't see his face, but I felt that he was smiling. Horror gripped me when I saw the glint of metal in his hand. It was a huge hunting knife. It felt like time slowed down as he slowly brought the blade to my neck. Tears streamed down my cheeks. I closed my eyes, preparing for the pain. My breathing became ragged. I was running out of air. "You're unlucky to be here," he whispered menacingly, engulfing me in a rush of impending panic. I huddled, resigning to my fate. How foolishly everything had turned out. Suddenly, footsteps were heard. A loud shout broke the silence of the forest. I opened my eyes and saw the maniac being thrown aside, and before me stood a young man in a police uniform, forcefully pushing the attacker away. "Run!" he shouted, pointing behind him. The paralysis I was in played against me. As soon as I took a step towards safety, the psychopath, knocked down by the policeman, grabbed my leg and pulled with force. Losing my balance, I fell, injuring my leg on the infamous hunting knife. I don't know how long our struggle lasted. All feelings and thoughts disappeared, and I focused only on one thing: survival. The maniac tried to lunge at me while simultaneously grappling with the policeman. He clearly overpowered him, but there were two of us against him. The policeman used his baton. I defended myself with bare hands. The longer the battle lasted, the more I gasped for breath. I felt my strength dwindling, and when he reached me with the knife raised high, I was already powerless to resist. But my savior didn't give up. Time and time again, he gained the upper hand, despite the lack of serious weaponry. Finally, we heard someone running towards us. A group of people emerged in the forest, reinforcements that came to the policeman's aid. The man with the knife was swiftly neutralized, and I felt strength returning to my body. The police escorted me out of the forest and back home. Later, I found out that I had been unlucky enough to encounter a serial killer. He had been under surveillance, as there wasn't enough evidence for an arrest. Fortunately, the officer leading the surveillance arrived in time. What happened had a profound impact on me. I often dream of situations where no one comes to my aid. Each time I wake up to my own screams. My parents support me and have arranged for me to see a therapist, hoping it will help. However, as of now, it hasn't yielded results. I'm still battling my demons. Today, I have decided to move to the city. As I packed my things, I carefully considered how I would live on. Graduation exams were ahead, followed by university enrollment. Whatever awaited me, one thing I knew for sure: I would never return to the forest. Never. My name is Rob, and I've lived my entire life in a small town in the southern United States. When I was a child, I often found myself in unpleasant situations. Usually, it didn't teach me much. But one incident sowed a fear in me forever, compelling me to be more cautious from then on. It happened when I had just turned 13. That summer evening, I decided to take a walk with my corgi, Jackson. My grandparents had given him to me when I turned 10. Since then, he became my faithful companion. I always cherished our evening walks. Typically, we strolled to a clearing near the forest. Jackson loved running with me or digging around for wild rodents. But this time, things didn't go as expected. It was around 6 in the evening when we arrived. It was beginning to get dark outside. I was hoping to walk the dog before sunset. About 10 minutes in, Jackson sniffed out something and started digging a hole. Eventually, he pulled out a bone. I was surprised. We had never found anything like this here before. Meanwhile, Jackson, after sniffing the bone, suddenly bolted toward the forest. Despite my cries, he swiftly vanished into the thicket. I raced after him, refusing to lose my friend. As I ran after Jackson, I didn't realize how far into the woods I would have to go. My dog had never behaved this way before. It was like he'd gone wild, sniffing something and then immediately darting into the thicket as if searching for something. After a while, I realized I was lost. Trees surrounded me, and the setting sun barely pierced through. I began to panic, realizing that I wouldn't be able to find my way out of the woods alone. But I needed to find Jackson. Losing my bearings, I stumbled deeper into the undergrowth. Suddenly, I spotted a house in the distance. It looked abandoned. It seemed like no one had lived there for a long time. The windows gaped at me with empty darkness. Unexpectedly, I heard whimpering from inside. It sounded like my dog. Overcoming my fear, I gathered my courage and decided to approach. As soon as I crossed the threshold of this strange house, my heart froze. Jackson was inside. He stood in the middle of the room, tail tucked, clearly terrified. Something wasn't right. The air in the room seemed suffused with fear and apprehension. I wanted to grab my dog and get out of that place as fast as possible. But as soon as I took my first step toward Jackson, I felt like someone was watching me. Turning around, I saw nothing but newspaper clippings on the walls. They were about recent murders across the country. The newspapers were fresh. And to my horror, there were candles burning on the table, next to the wall. I grabbed Jackson, horrified by the scene. Suddenly, the front door slammed shut with great force. My feeble attempts to open it led to nothing. It was as if it was being held shut from the other side. The house plunged into darkness. The light only illuminated the table, leaving everything else in shadow. Jackson and I found ourselves trapped. Time dragged on. The event seemed like an endless nightmare to me. I stood in the dark house, not knowing what to do. Someone was inside, watching me from the shadows. Suddenly, a strong hand coiled around my neck. I felt my breath being constricted. In vain attempts to break free, I helplessly spun around, feeling my strength leaving me. Meanwhile, Jackson, who had been in my arms the whole time, growled and clutched onto the hand that was choking me. Seizing the moment, I tightly held onto my dog and rushed out onto the street. This time, the door was not locked. I ran from that house without looking back. I felt like someone was pursuing me, but I tried not to pay attention. All I wanted was to get away from that nightmarish place with my dog. We ran for what felt like an eternity. Jackson whimpered in my arms, as if sensing the danger chasing us. With my last ounces of strength, I finally emerged from the woods and returned to our clearing. Looking back, I saw movement among the trees. It became clear to me then that I would never be able to forget what had happened. That dreadful house left terrifying memories in my soul. Since then, I've avoided the woods and tried not to dwell on what occurred. I don't know what it was. I don't know how long it had been there. Of course, I told my parents, and they notified the police. When they entered the house, it was empty. There were no newspapers, no candles. Sometimes at night, it feels like I hear rustling from the direction of the woods. I've always loved adventures and adrenaline. Since childhood, I've adored extreme sports, hikes, and travels. My name is Rick. Just recently, my wife Emily and I got married. By the way, she shares my interests as well. That's why we decided to spend the upcoming weekend by taking a short hike through the woods and setting up a tent near the lake. We wanted to escape the hustle and bustle of the city, enjoy the beauty of nature, and spend time together. Preparation didn't take long, and soon we set off on our journey. It was a quiet and peaceful morning when my wife Emily and I headed into the depths of the forest. We were full of enthusiasm and joy, unaware of what we were about to encounter. The forest was beautiful and teeming with life. We walked along the trail, enjoying nature and discussing our plans for the future. However, as we ventured deeper into the forest, I felt that something was amiss. The air seemed heavy and filled with an inexplicable sense of unease. We decided to take a break and have a meal. We found a cozy spot among the tall trees and laid out everything needed for cooking. It was quiet and serene all around. The sun was slowly setting behind the horizon, leaving only faint shafts of light. Initially, nothing out of the ordinary happened. Emily and I sat, talked, and enjoyed each other's company. But over time, strange sounds began to emanate from the surrounding forest. It started with a quiet rustle of leaves, then intermittent crackling of branches. We exchanged frightened glances. The sounds grew louder. They couldn't be attributed to normal forest noises. They sounded as if someone was hiding amidst the foliage. Then, I noticed some movement in the bushes. Fearing it might be a wild animal, we armed ourselves with small axes and set out to investigate. At the spot where the movement had been noticed, no one was found. However, I noticed something strange. There were footprints, not an animal's but a human's. They were bare footprints. Emily and I thoroughly surveyed the surroundings but found no one. Eventually, we had to return to our campsite. A dreadful sight awaited us. All our belongings were scattered across the camp. Food supplies, clothes, tools, everything had been pulled out, turning our backpacks inside out. It seemed as if intruders were looking for something, but nothing was missing or damaged. We hurriedly gathered our things. Someone was watching us, and we couldn't stay here. With our belongings in hand, we promptly started moving back. But soon, we noticed that the path had vanished. The trees and bushes, which had seemed familiar on our way into the forest, now looked completely different. Panic set in. Surveying the forest around us, I realized that Emily and I were lost in this impenetrable labyrinth. We wandered through the woods, trying to find a way out, but every step felt futile. Day turned into night, and we were still lost, feeling as though the forest would never end. Despair consumed us. We were tired and had lost all hope of escaping. But suddenly, a small trail appeared ahead. Without wasting time, holding each other's hands, we followed this direction. The journey didn't take long and led us straight to the lake. Emily and I looked at each other, experiencing mixed feelings of fear and hope. What was happening to us? Who had scattered our belongings? Who had left footprints? Why did we get lost? And then quickly found our way to the lake. Neither of us had any answers, but something needed to be done. We were exhausted, hungry, and tired. Leaving the forest in the middle of the night seemed impossible. It was decided that we would set up camp and spend the night there. Everything went surprisingly calm. We lit a campfire, had dinner, and then Emily decided to take a dip in the lake. I didn't wait for her and went to sleep. Fatigue had taken its toll, and I almost instantly fell asleep. The silence of the night was shattered by a piercing scream. It was my wife screaming. I instantly leapt out of the tent and ran to help. Emily was sitting on the shore, holding herself with her arms wrapped around her and pulling her legs close to her chin. She was trembling uncontrollably. I sat next to her, encircling her shoulders, trying to find out what had happened. Stammering and avoiding looking at the water, Emily recounted that there was something in the water. She had barely ventured away from the shore when she felt something grab her by the leg and pull her under. She managed to free herself with great difficulty. After a while, my wife regained her composure, and we went to sleep. We locked ourselves inside the tent, preparing for a long night. Just as we had fallen asleep, we heard strange sounds from outside. It sounded like rustling and the whispering of leaves, as if someone was making their way through the forest, getting closer and closer. Then it turned into something akin to the chants of several people. At times it seemed to morph into animalistic howls. My heart raced furiously in my chest. Every sound evoked terror and apprehension. The sounds grew closer and more aggressive. They began to resemble someone's displeasure, someone's bestial growling. Meanwhile, we sat inside the tent, trembling with fear, not knowing what to do. Our entire trip had turned into a nightmare. Suddenly, everything became silent. It took some time for us to gather ourselves. After everything that had happened, sleep eluded us, so we went to the campfire. As we approached, we unexpectedly noticed that we were not alone. A group of people sat around. They were dressed in black attire, their faces concealed beneath hoods. They noticed us and silently invited us to sit with them by the fire. Who were they? And what were they doing there? We decided to approach them and ask for help, but instead of an answer, they slowly began to turn towards us. Their black hoods hid their faces, and we couldn't discern their expressions. A thought crept into my mind that our lives were in danger. We need to run. I squeezed Emily's hand, signaling my intentions. She nodded in response. My heart pounded in my chest as we abruptly stood up and ran away. They began to pursue us, and we ran faster, consumed by fear. Finally, we managed to emerge from the forest onto the highway. We flagged down the first car that passed by and asked for a ride to the nearest town. It was the scariest and most horrifying day of our lives. We will never know who those people were. I still can't be sure if they were even human. The forest will never be a safe place for us again. Since then, we have led a calm and measured life. We no longer seek out extreme adventures, preferring comfort and security. We have learned to value our lives and look out for each other, trying not to expose ourselves to unnecessary risks. That night in the forest has become a part of our past. We are no longer inclined to play with our lives, choosing to enjoy a world far removed from the mysterious and frightening sounds of the forest.